Okay, so Dr. Emma, we are very interested in what you have to say. Please teach us.
Okay, thanks, Peter. And thank you everyone for turning up to listen to us on a Saturday morning as well. So what I want to do in this talk is to think through some of the various ways in which we can and cannot see the 7th century conversion to Christianity in the burial record. So I'm going to be talking about things at a variety of different scales here. So I'm going to start by thinking very broad scale about this broader evolution of burial practice and especially the use of grave goods over that period of conversion and whether or not we can link that to any of the religious changes that are happening at the same time. And then for the second part of this talk, I'm going to zoom in and think about a specific form of burial that appears in the 7th century and often has Christian symbolism associated with it, and that is bed burial. So some of this work has already been published, so I will point that out where possible, so you can go and read more if you're interested. Some of it is not quite published yet, but is under review with journals at the moment, so hopefully will be out in a more complete form fairly soon. So the decline in grave goods use that we see across the 7th century is something that's long been seen as a result of the conversion to Christianity, but also something that's been challenged quite a bit in recent years. So there are currently very few academics, I think, who would argue for a direct correlation between religious change and burial change. But I don't think we've necessarily done a good job of communicating that outside of academic circles. So I was actually giving a public talk the other week and I just sort of skimmed over that fact and then had lots of questions from the audience about why conversion to Christianity didn't cause burial change. So I think there's still quite a strong understanding that unfurnished burial is Christian and furnished burial is non-Christian. And all the debates about why that's not necessarily the case in the academic spheres have yet to really make it into public understanding. And this is despite the fact that objects with quite strong Christian imagery appear in graves in England. So, some of our earliest evidence for Christianization comes from furnished, not unfurnished burials. So as a classic example of this, I've got a picture of the Trumpington cross here. So this is from the grave of a young woman who died at some point in the late 7th century and was buried in Trumpington on the outskirts of Cambridge. So it's got some loops on the back that suggest it was sewn onto some sort of clothing. And of course, a cross is quite a simple symbol that's also used in contexts that aren't Christian. So, and it's also possible that it's being used to express a Christian identity for political purposes rather than being a genuine expression of belief. Because when all of your nobility are converting to Christianity, also converting is perhaps a politically expedient thing to do. But another reason why we've started to move away from the idea that unfurnished burial is Christian is some of the evidence from burials outside of England, from elsewhere in the Frankish world, that are actually from within churches, but are still incredibly richly furnished. So as an example of this, we can look at this pair of burials from underneath Cologne Cathedral. And these graves date to sometime in the early 6th century. So at this point in time, this part of the Frankish world was Christian still, even if England was not. And we have a grave down here at the bottom of a young woman around 21 years old when she died. And she was buried with all of her jewellery. And you can see some of the other offerings in this reconstruction drawing here. So some of the glass vessels, chests, elaborate buckets, quite a lot of objects. And then next to her was the burial of a boy between 5 and 6 years old. And he was buried in this bed with this range of weapons with him. Some of which are child-sized, so were clearly made for him. Some of which are adult-sized. So this is the reconstruction of the helmet that was found in the grave. The boy buried in this grave could never have actually worn that. So that's an adult-sized helmet. He's also got with him a drinking horn, a bronze basin, more of these glass vessels. And between the two graves in this chamber are a series of plates that were laden with food offerings, so particularly things like fruits and nuts. And this is within the early cathedral in Cologne. So these are two very, very richly furnished burials in a really obviously Christian context. Another part of the reason why most archaeologists have rejected the idea that the decline in gravewood use is linked to religious change is due to some of the new chronological work which has been done, which really split apart those two events. So this graph that I'm showing you here, this is from John Hines's and Alex Spalis's big study of changes in gravewood use across the 6th to 7th centuries. And they use quite a complex methodology integrating radiocarbon dates and artifact styles and using correspondence analysis to come up with this pattern of when furnished burials were most popular. So they proposed this model in which gravewood use is really, really high here in the middle of the 6th century, but then it drops off so that by the time you get to the start of the 7th century, gravewood use is actually quite low. And then for male burials, which is this full line, that remains so throughout the 7th century. But female burials, they start increasing again in their richness towards the second half of the 7th century before there's a very, very rapid drop off. And then after about 680, 685, Hines and Bayliss are arguing that basically no one is being buried with grave goods. Now, there are some very rich male burials that date to the early 7th century, which aren't really flagged in this model. And so those are the princely graves, sites like Sutton Hoo, like Prittlewell, like Taplow, graves which have an awful lot of stuff in them and date to that early 7th century period. But there aren't many of them, and so they don't really make much of an impact in an overall model like this. So yeah, when you look at that historically documented date of conversion, 597 AD, when Augustine lands in Kent, everything Ken's just been telling us about. Well, in this model, that lies right in that period, well after gravewood use first began declining, but well before that second flourishing of furnishing. So it doesn't really match up with any of our understandings of burial change. Now, Hines and Bayliss do suggest that this final abandonment around 685 may have been related to some of Archbishop Theodore's restructuring of the English church in the 680s, although I have some doubts about that I'll get onto in a little bit. And this is undoubtedly a brilliant piece of work that's completely transformed our understanding of what burial is doing in England. But I do have some doubts about it. So the methodology that they used in this study, it's quite technical, so I won't go into it. I'm not going to pretend that there's a particularly easy read to understand exactly what they did. But the methodology they used required graves to have at least 2 objects in them, and those objects also had to be found in at least 2 graves. So automatically, this means the limits of the methods they were using meant they had to exclude the more simply furnished graves and also the unfurnished graves, as well as some of the graves with rarer objects in them. So their model is only giving us a partial view of what was going on with burial, biased towards those richer, more distinctive graves. So when I was looking around for a potential alternative way of looking at it that would include the entire spectrum of furnishing, not just those richer ones, one method of doing that is to look at radiocarbon dated graves, because theoretically, as long as people have sampled the full spectrum of graves, you can access them that way. So radiocarbon dating, as a brief summary, for those of you who aren't quite sure how it works, carbon has a radioactive isotope, carbon-14. It's produced in the upper atmosphere and then gets into living things via the food chain. So plants take it in when they photosynthesize, and then when animals eat those plants, it gets into their bones. But when those plants and animals die and they stop taking in carbon-14, that's when the process of decay starts. So radioactive isotopes decay at a constant rate that we can measure. So for radiocarbon, we expect about half of the sample to decay every 5,730 years or so. So by counting the amount of radiocarbon left in a sample and then measuring across on the graph here, we can work out roughly how long ago something died. However, this does not give us an exact date. It gives us a broader range of probability for a sample to fall into. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that there is some inevitable level of uncertainty over the measurement of radioactive carbon in a sample. And this is something that has improved as lab techniques have improved. So the date that I've got here on the left, I can't remember exactly when this sample was processed, but there is an error on this date of plus or minus 80 years on the measured radiocarbon age. The measurement on the right is a much more recent one when our lab techniques for measuring these things have improved. And this date only has an error range of 28 years on it. But the second reason why radiocarbon measurements vary in how accurate they are is that you have to adjust for variation in starting levels of radiocarbon in the atmosphere. Because the amount of radiocarbon in the atmosphere is not constant, it varies with solar radiation. And so you have to calibrate those measured dates against something called the calibration curve, which is what is being shown on these graphs here. We've got the calibration curve in blue, the measured radiocarbon age in red, and then you essentially read across, and wherever you hit the calibration curve, it gives you this probability curve below. So the curve has some nice steep sections in it, which produce really nice tight dates. And it also has some flatter sections, some plateaus, where if a sample dates to that period, you just inevitably get quite a broad probability range. So the first date that has a large error on it, it also hits some of those plateaus in the calibration curve that mean that this particular sample could date to anywhere within a 250-year period. This one on the right, with its narrower range, hits a steeper section of the calibration curve. And this one you can date much more precisely to somewhere within a 65-year period. So just taking a load of radiocarbon dated burials and looking at them is complicated by some of these differential probability ranges. What we can do then is use some computational methods to combine these probabilities from lots of radiocarbon dates to get a sense of when there is most archaeological activity happening. And this is based on the dates as data principle, which basically just says that if you have enough radiocarbon dates, they can act as a proxy for past activity levels. And if you have a big enough data set, periods of time with lots of activity will be represented by lots of radiocarbon dates, and periods when there wasn't much activity will have very few radiocarbon dates. So the methodologies for doing this have really been refined by prehistorians, and they've tended to look over much broader timescales than what we as medievalists are interested in, and questions of overall population levels have dominated. So I brought up this study as an example because it's, I think, particularly pioneering. It looked at human population in Britain and Ireland right from the 8th millennium BC through to the middle of the 2nd millennium AD. And there's over 30,000 radiocarbon dates in there from all sorts of materials. So the dark red line is the sum of all those radiocarbon probabilities. The grey is a simulated population that they've compared it to. And then the red areas are areas where we have a higher population based on the dates than you might expect. And the blue is where there's a lower population. So their model does cover the early medieval period. And you can see that they suggest this increase in population levels from the late Roman period, peaking towards the end of the 1st millennium AD. And this, of course, brings up a major issue with this method, that it's based on an assumption that radiocarbon dates are a random sample of the material that exists to be dated, which is not true. There is researcher bias in what we choose to radiocarbon date. So the authors of this paper suggest that this dip in the Roman period, it's not because there was a collapse in population. It's because Roman material culture is so distinctive that Romanists rarely employ radiocarbon dating. So there's been a few studies that have tried to apply this method to the early medieval period, but not to look at the population levels like the example before, but to instead look at dates associated with specific types of burial, on how common different funerary behaviours may have been. So this includes some of Adrian Maldonado's work, looking at the frequency of different structures associated with Scottish burials. And it's also been used to look at the balance of cremation versus inhumation in Ireland and in Belgium. But no one's applied this technique to any material from England yet. So I wanted to see if I could use similar methods to think about how gravegood use might have changed over the 6th and 7th centuries. So this work that I'm about to show isn't published yet, but it is with a journal at the moment. So fingers crossed it will get through review fine and be out before too long. So the first step in doing this work was compiling that database of all the radiocarbon dated graves from England between the 2nd centuries AD and the 10th century AD. Because for this method to work well, you need as many dates as possible. And you also want to go slightly wider than the period of time that you're really interested in, so that you don't end up with edge effects. So thankfully, there are a number of online databases that made compiling this information quite easy, especially as I started doing this during a lockdown, so libraries were not accessible. And then my starting point was that big scale study that I just showed you, to which I had to add contextual information about the nature of the burial. And then you've got date lists published from the Oxford Radiocarbon Labs, so a record of everything that they have dated. You've got the English Heritage date lists, everything that they've funded radiocarbon dating of, as well as all of the grey literature on the Archaeological Data Service, which does have a lot of radiocarbon dated early medieval graves from commercial excavations, which don't always make it into the academic sphere. So this has given me a data set of 1,069 radiocarbon dated graves. And for each of those, I've tried to record the sex and age of the individual, whether or not it has any grave goods and how many, whether or not it's part of a big cemetery or it's an isolated burial, as well as any stable isotope information that can give us information on diets. And this is important because if you eat a lot of fish, that can affect your radiocarbon dates. So that needs to be adjusted for. Not all of this information is available for every grave, and that was mostly a problem if the date only appeared in either the Oxford or the English Heritage date lists, and I haven't been able to track down if it was properly published or where. So it's slightly messy data, but it's a big enough data set that the messiness hopefully doesn't cause major problems. So I'm not going to talk about exactly what I did because that's going to get very technical very quickly, and it's much more fun to go on and talk about the results. So the radiocarbon model puts this peak in furnished burial quite firmly at the start of the 7th century, after which point it declines, but there is still a decent number of furnished burials in the 8th century, and it's not until the 9th century that it becomes really rare. Looking at unfurnished burials over the same period, you can see them increasing over the course of the 7th century. And if you look closely, it's quite small on this particular model, but there is a slight dip in the number of unfurnished burials around 600 AD. And this is more noticeable on slightly different iterations if I start splitting it up regionally. So although it's not very clear there, I'm pretty sure there is a dip in unfurnished burials at that point. And if you think back to Hines and Baylis's model, Where I have my peak in burial furnishing is pretty much exactly where they have their low point. And I have furnishing going on later here as well. So there's some things that need explaining there. But before I get onto that, I want to go through a few other patterns if you start splitting this data set into different subcategories. So there's differences in the frequencies of male and female furnished burial over time. For female burials, you can't really see very clearly that peak in 600 AD. It's part of a much longer elongated phase of furnishing, starting in the mid-5th century and then dropping off slower than we might expect over the course of the 7th century. But for the male burials, that peak early in the 7th century is much more pronounced and drops off much more rapidly. And this interests me because this is the period that those princely burials like Sutton Hoo date to. And the dates for the princely burials are in here, but they're not enough on their own to cause that peak. And this suggests that they're the real pinnacle of a much broader trend, that at that point in time, there was a lot of investment going into male graves. Something else I did to try and understand the 7th century changes a bit better was pull out all of the graves that contain precious materials. So gold, silver, gemstones, which are mostly garnets. And this is a bit of a crude way for selecting for those rich burials, but it's difficult to come up with a method that doesn't involve drawing artificial categories around certain types of graves. And this sort of matches with what we already expected, that these burials with particularly rich materials are rare before the 6th century, and are then at their most common across the 7th and into the 8th century as well. This isn't a huge number of burials by any means. There are 49 in total in this category. And so the grey on these diagrams is the error envelope, which is quite large in this case. So this model is vulnerable to being revised if we get more radiocarbon dates. But, you know, those richer burials, they're almost as common in the 8th century as they were in the 7th. And it's also worth noting that 80% of the graves in this category are female graves. So, as I said before, one of the big critiques of this sort of method is that this is just a reflection of what archaeologists have chosen to radiocarbon date. It doesn't reflect any sort of past reality. So, going back to this overall furnishing graph, it's really important to think about what else could be causing this peak. If it is a real archaeological pattern, or if for some reason this period's just been intensively targeted for dating. Everything right at the start of the model in the 4th century, I think that is definitely lower than it was in reality, due to that issue I already mentioned, that Romanists tend to use radiocarbon dating less than other periods might. So unfortunately, that's a bit of researcher bias. And I also think that this tail going into the 8th century is maybe a bit higher than it was in reality, because if furnished graves look maybe slightly unusually late, they're perhaps more likely to be targeted for radiocarbon than other graves are. But I am convinced that this early 7th century peak is real. Firstly, because I can't think of a reason why we would have disproportionately sampled that period for dating. If you have a peak really early on, then maybe it's people trying to target the earliest graves in the cemetery, but that's not what we've got. And the fact that that is also a low point for unfurnished burial, I think suggests that this is a real phenomenon, that there are genuinely a higher proportion of burials being furnished then. And as I'm about to show, lots of other things also peak at the start of the 7th century. Because I started just by looking at grave goods, but then I realized that all sorts of other aspects of burial can be modeled in this way. So I wanted to look a bit at funerary space, about where burials are being put, if they are in these big communal cemeteries, or if they are in smaller, more disparate groups, or completely isolated. And the beauty of isolated burials is that if you find one on an excavation, they are really likely targets for radiocarbon dating, usually because they're a bit of a surprise, so you want to know as much as possible about them. So I'm very confident that this is an accurate representation of isolated burials over time, even though still only 72 graves, there's not that many of them. And to a slightly lesser extent, the same is true for these very small groups of burials. And here I'm talking about less than 5 burials grouped together. So yeah, you can see this increase in the large communal cemeteries over time. But then these smaller groups of burials are at their most common in the late 4th, early 5th centuries, before they decline to a low point around 600 AD. And the isolated burials are sort of common in the 4th century, then become a bit less so, and then peak again around 600 AD. So there is a lot going on around 600 AD, with the peaks in furnishing, peaks in isolated burials, and the start of that high point for the really richly furnished graves, as well as being a low point for unfurnished burials and for those smaller groups of cemeteries, which suggests that all of these things are connected and represent real patterns. Exactly what's going on here is a little bit harder to explain. So this is clearly a period when investing in material, sometimes rich material, is hugely important. And it's also important that it's being seen. So I think there's a link between that investment in burial and the general avoidance of smaller burial grounds where fewer people can gather to see that display. But then isolated burials also peak at the same point in time, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but I think it's just a slightly different manifestation of the same thing, of using burial display to make a very visible statement. And in the case of isolated burials, that statement is being visible and having ownership over a certain territory. So they're often being put on prominent spots and key boundaries. So the radiocarbon dates are painting a picture of that turn of the century as a really key point for investment in funerary rituals. And this has kind of shifted that chronology of burial change back to some of our earlier understandings before Hines and Baylis's work. So back in 1997, Helen Geek suggested that gravewood use began to decline around the middle of the 7th century and gravewood use was abandoned by 720-ish AD. And she also pointed to the difficulty of seeing early 7th century burials. So she said that in this period, people tended to use particularly long-lived styles of objects, things that were in use for well over a century. And there aren't really many distinctive object styles that you can date to that late 6th, early 7th century period. And this, I think, is why you have the difference between those radiocarbon models and what Hines and Baylis worked with, because they were primarily concerned with dating artifact styles. So based on those radiocarbon models, we have a chronology of burial change that does line up slightly better with conversion than it did before. But I want to be clear that I'm definitely not going back to arguing for Christianization causing the abandonment of furnished burial. Because when you start looking at what's going on with the differences between male and female graves, it's clearly a little bit more complicated than that. You know, the early 7th century is a period where there's a bit of social upheaval. Christianization is part of that social upheaval, but there are also broader changes to do with the emergence of an elite that's being reflected in that richer level of funerary investment. So maybe conversion is a part of it, but it's definitely not the whole part of it. So I now want to pivot slightly from talking about those broader patterns to talk about whether individual graves can provide evidence of Christian belief, even if the big patterns can't. I'll talk specifically about bed burials, which in England is something that appears in the 7th century and often contains overt symbols of Christianization. So I thought I would show this one from Harpole near Northampton as an example, because it's very recently excavated. You know, it was only announced in December 2020, and you may well have seen it on the news then, but it has yet to be fully studied or published. It's also by far the most elaborate of the 20 or so bed burials that have been found in England. So it contained this stunning necklace with its central clasp made of gold and garnet with the cross symbolism on there. There are coins on the necklace, there's inset gems, and as well as the necklace, you've got this huge silver cross, which is still being excavated from the block of soil that it was lifted from, that you can see this huge garnet in the center of it, just so you can see on the X-ray that's starting to emerge now. Now, as I said at the start, just because it contains a cross does not automatically mean it is Christian. And, if this necklace was found on its own, I think there would be some debate over whether that cross symbol in the middle of the clasp is Christian or whether it's just a nice decoration. The combination of that with the processional cross makes a Christian identification much more likely in this case, I think. But, the gold, the garnets, the silver, they're high status objects in their own right. So you could argue that they were included because of the value of the material, not necessarily because of any Christian connotations. So there's overlap here between status and Christianity. And this is one of a small number of bed burials which are known from across England. On a map, Harpole will be around here. This figure is from Sam Lucy's publication on the Trumpington bed burial. So yeah, hasn't been updated to reflect that. So all of these bed burials date to the 7th century, and they are all women. Many others also contain symbols of Christian belief. So we've got the Trumpington cross, the Ixworth cross. Some of these symbols are a little bit more tenuous. So this is the satchel mount from the Swallow Cliff Down burial, which some people have tried to argue is a stylized Cairo, which personally I think is wishful thinking by someone trying really hard to find Christian symbolism. So if I draw a Cairo over the top, you can sort of see it, but I had to draw it to work out what they were talking about. There's also been suggestions that the connotations of sleep that go along with the bed is related to Christian understandings of the dead as just being sleeping before the resurrection. But there's nothing exclusively Christian about sleep as a metaphor for death. You can see that in some of the pre-Christian burials where you have them positioned like with the hands by the face as if they are asleep. Now, two colleagues of mine, Sam Leggett at Edinburgh and Alice Rose at Durham, have done isotope analysis on 3 of these bed burials. So the one from Trumpington and 2 from Edix Hill, which are all near Cambridge. And isotopic analysis is a technique which looks at the chemical signatures in teeth that give you an idea of where someone was when that tooth enamel was forming, so during their childhood. And the 2 main ones we use are oxygen and strontium for mobility. So broadly speaking, oxygen tells you about the climate that someone grew up in, while strontium tells you about the underlying geology of the area they grew up in. So we have oxygen and strontium for these 3 women, which suggests that none of them grew up anywhere in the British Isles. So although the strontium values do fit with the geology of Cambridgeshire, the oxygen values do not. They indicate an origin in a much colder climate than anywhere you find in the British Isles. Which brings us to the question of if you find bed burials anywhere else, which you do. There's this concentration that you get along the Rhine and in southern Germany, as well as a few dotted further afield. So you've got one over in Slovakia, one in Thuringia that I've recently come across that I've yet to add to this map, and then a few up in Scandinavia. So this is all from this paper of mine on bed burials, which is open access. The isotopes, the data has been published as part of a broader data paper, but we are working on writing those up more fully at the moment and really talking about where we think those women may have come from. So the chronological distribution of those beds is quite good. We have good data from dendrochronological dates from a lot of the continental ones where you have wood surviving. And England, you can really see in green there the 7th century dates of almost all the English ones that can be dated. But that is not the case elsewhere. So the earliest examples are from the first half of the 5th century, and that's the one over in Slovakia, and also this one at Föhring in Bavaria on the Danube. Then the ones throughout southern Germany and along the Rhine are much more of a mix of 6th and 7th century ones in date. And the Scandinavian ones are some of the latest. So we've got some dating to the Viking Age, but that's not exactly surprising because Scandinavia is the part of Europe where furnished burial lasts longest. But there are also some earlier ones up in Scandinavia too. So the chronologies elsewhere are really quite mixed, and England stands out as being chronologically this very homogeneous entity. The other notable feature of the English burials is the predominance of women in them. And again, that's something that's unique when you look at the European scale. So in England, we have one masculine burial, that's the one from Lapwing Hill. And that assessment is based on the presence of a sword and 2 spearheads in the grave, not on the bones themselves. There's also one burial from Shudi Camps in Cambridgeshire that osteologically was assessed as being probably male, but the grave goods within that grave were more feminine. So on the map, the feminine burials are circles and the masculine ones are triangles. And that's, in a lot of cases, that is based off the grave goods, not the osteology, because some of these are antiquarian digs and also ones where you just don't have good bone preservation. And this demonstrates that while England is indeed dominated by women, elsewhere there's much more of an even mix. So one of the best examples of a bed burial from the continent is also a masculine one. That's this grave from Trossingen. Osteologically, it is a male, and it also has very stereotypically masculine assemblage. So you can see in this reconstruction drawing, it's buried with his sword clasped by his side. There's a shield on the wall. He's also got this musical instrument, which is another rare thing about it. And the bed is one of the best preserved examples of the bed that we have. If we go back to the overall map, the Scandinavian burials are also looking slightly more masculine. There are only women in the graves at Oseberg and Villahoy, but there are also some slight biases there. So one of the sites, Valskerda, there's a gender difference in rites. So the inhumations at that site where you find beds are male, the cremations at the site are much more likely to be female. And this difference between England and elsewhere, I wondered at first if it was a dating issue, but it's not. So it's not that the rite as a whole becomes feminine in the 7th century. If I highlight those 7th century ones in green, you can see that the 7th century ones on the continent are masculine. Although there's not a great deal of overlap in good chronological evidence and identifiable gender. And the English ones are also mostly adult women too. We have the same issues with a lack of osteological evidence when it comes to age, but there are a number of smaller beds on the continents that we can say were made for children. And it's not common by any means for children to be given bed burials on the continent, but they do exist. So one of the most well-known examples is the child from that double grave under Cologne Cathedral that I showed you right at the start. And it's also interesting that the 2 youngest individuals, by quite some way, are also the only bed burials found within churches. So that's the Cologne one, and we also have a 2 to 4-year-old child who was buried in the Church of St. Martin in Weissenberg. So that's only 2 examples, and I don't know if we can really say much about it, but it's worth noting nonetheless. And when we look at this broader scale, there aren't really particular associations of continental bed burials with Christianity. There's those 2 from within churches, and then we have this one from Lauchheim-Mittelhofen, which had 5 gold foil crosses associated with it. And those are quite characteristic of the conversion period in southern Germany. And then there's this one from Pfahlheim-Rennweg, where the only object alongside the bed burial was this chest that was decorated with these stylized depictions of angels. Now in the publication, this was very confidently identified as being a depiction of the archangels Gabriel and Michael, although I'm not entirely sure what they based that on because I can't see anything there. So that's 4 continental burials that have overtly Christian connotations. So I wouldn't say that there's a sign that bed burial overall has a strongly Christian context. So given that bed burial doesn't appear in England until the 7th century, I would argue that it was introduced into Britain as part of a specific process. And given the strongly gendered nature of the rite and the evidence from the isotopes, it may have been introduced specifically as a result of women's mobility. So if we're thinking of the context in which women may have been moving into England in the 7th century, the conversion to Christianity is an obvious one. So this could be related to marriage. We have plenty of historical records of Christian women marrying non-Christian men as part of that conversion process. Queen Bertha of Kent is the most obvious example of that. But it could also be related to the founding of religious houses, which provided a network of sister houses crossing both Francia and England, providing the means for women to move between them. So the isotopic evidence doesn't let us narrow down exactly where our women came from, but the region of southern Germany, where so many of the other beds were found, is a possibility. So if this burial rite was introduced to England by Christian women, it could have taken on connotations of Christianity and femininity there that it did not originally have. There's nothing intrinsically Christian about burying someone in a bed, but that combination of evidence for the English burials lets us suggest that in that context, it probably was a Christian rite. So just an overall summary, in the absence of any greater information about who the people in all these graves were, it is almost impossible to say for certain whether or not they held Christian beliefs. Even if they are displaying overtly Christian imagery in the way they're buried, it's very possible that they're doing so for political or cultural reasons rather than because they are believers. And there's no real sense in the conversion period that burial with grave goods is in any way unchristian. And in fact, some of those obviously Christian burials are those with objects. So when we're talking about seeing belief in the burial record, it's very difficult to do that. But if you then start taking into account multiple different aspects of the rite, including the objects, their context, any scientific information about the people buried in the grave, it becomes possible to start identifying burial forms that may have had Christian associations, even if they're not immediately obvious. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emma. That was really interesting, and you presented some very, very complex analysis and science in a very understandable way. Thank you. Can I ask, and please add your questions in chat again. So are we to imagine, even based on your presentation, that there was a growing perspective within the church, maybe over a much, much longer period though, that Christians not necessarily were forbidden from being buried with grave goods. And as an Orthodox priest, I've always found that sort of black and white thinking not part of my own culture, but that it was not so necessary. You were not trying to communicate the same things. Is that an aspect of why it began to drop off, perhaps? You didn't need to represent the same things to your community. Yeah,
I think so. That culturally, unfurnished burial becomes associated with Christianity much later. And something else I've written about is some of the sort of mid-7th century changes in Christian understandings of the afterlife that started to make grave goods not forbidden but unnecessary within that framework, that understanding of what happens after death. So yeah, I think later on you do get associations with unfurnished burial and Christianity, but not because there's any like prohibition against it within what the church is saying, just because culturally it becomes unnecessary.
Yes, fantastic. We have a couple of questions. Very informative presentation and data, thank you. Do you see any relationship between the slow reduction in grave goods and a decline in indigenous production happening shortly earlier in England, and the presence of long-lived cultural items, styles noted by Geek? Would a reducing availability through time or increasing value of goods be partly responsible for initiating a decline in goods included within burials of the common population?
Yeah, okay, that's quite a complex question, and there's quite a lot to unpack in that. I don't know if we do see a decline in indigenous production necessarily. I think what we see instead is just almost changes in fashions, which I don't think we're very good at thinking about archaeologically. And I'm including myself in that, you know, how you get your head around why object styles change and what makes certain styles become more popular. Because we are seeing objects being produced over that late 6th and 7th century period. It's just that they're being produced in almost conservative styles. You know, people aren't experimenting quite so much with styles of objects, and they're not trying new things out in quite the same way. Why that is something I need to think more about. I'm still sort of unsure on that one. Yeah, in terms of like reducing availability or increasing value of goods, I don't think that that's what we're seeing. I think there's evidence from production and settlement sites, that their goods are still available. And we're seeing high status things being put in graves. So it's not that things are so rare that they have to be kept, that people can't afford to deposit them. People are depositing them, and in fact they're starting to deposit the rich things slightly more frequently. So yes, sorry, quite a lot to think about there. I hope I answered that okay.
Fantastic. I'll read these. I can see that you can see the questions, but I'll read them out for the video. Thanks, Emma, for a great paper. Could these women be recruited to be abbesses at English startup houses? And are there parallels for those garnet-mounted crosses on the continent?
Yeah, I absolutely think they could be abbesses. So recruited from Frankish religious houses that are earlier establishments, and even if not abbesses, women who are sent over to help establish the houses with the support of the English nobility, because you see a lot of high status English women founding monasteries in this period. There are not parallels for the garnet crosses on the continent. The most common cross iconography we see over there are those little gold foil ones. So they're very thin, they're very delicate. They were almost certainly made for burial just because they wouldn't last if you were wearing them for very long. We see very few of those gold foil crosses in England. I think the only example I can think of is Crittlewell, which is one of the earliest burials with that sort of cross iconography. But no, the garnet ones we don't find on the continent.
And the final question, perhaps. Love the statistical analysis, fascinating lecture and helpful myth busting. A quick question on what you meant by actual Christian belief being difficult to identify. Isn't this more of a modern concern than an ancient concern? To what extent are we able to unpick true belief versus cultural belief? And did ancient Britons think in this way? I guess this has a lot of crossover with the topic of crypto-religion. Yeah,
that's an excellent point. And I guess I'm speaking there to a lot of the sort of academic debates about, can you see belief? Did these people believe in a Christian God? And yeah, I would actually agree with you that that sort of religious belief versus cultural practice isn't something that we can unpick for the period, and maybe isn't important to unpick. So yeah, I totally believe with you. I totally agree with you that is a bit of a modern anachronism that I'm using there, just to try and, I guess, get my points across.
I do find that I am an Orthodox priest, and I do feel a connection with the religious culture of my ancestors, our ancestors, and I do feel when I sometimes watch television programs and it is almost suggested this wasn't really a Christian, but as the questioner says, that's an entirely modern understanding. It's even only a very Western understanding of what it means, because I am a priest in a culture where people are Christian in lots of different ways, but they are really Christian, you know, but it's not the same in every case, you know. These are all wonderful questions. Thank you. Also, just one last question from me. Is there a sense that these bed burials are very high status, princely, you know, kingly, queenly, and that this also demonstrates the elite origin of many of the founders of religious houses in this country? We know obviously later on many of the princesses, queens became abbesses, but was this something that happened from the very beginning, that princesses would be very high status women would be recruited and they bring over their burial culture with them?
Yeah. They are not quite as high status as something like Sutton Hoo. So if you're talking like the really, really rich burials, they are male. The real investment is going into those male burials. But within the female sphere, the bed burials are mostly very rich, comparative to other women. So we're seeing the elite women there. And the beds themselves are quite a high status object, because most people would not have had the luxury of having their own wooden bed frame. That's an investment to have that, and then to bury it in a grave, that's a sacrifice of wealth. So yeah, the bed itself is indicating status as well as having all these other rich objects with them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Emma. That was really interesting. Again, we'll post a link in the chat to your open paper, which I read with great interest as someone who knows nothing. It was very readable indeed. I'm going to turn off the recording now,